Attendance is 100 and I don't know how many points. So those of, I don't know why I'm talking to you guys who are here, but people who aren't are going to have a little shock at the end of the semester, I'm afraid. So we talked about defining mental illness on Wednesday. We finished up chapter 13. Today, we're going to talk about some psychological disorders. It's going to be a zoom through a lot of examples. Like I said, if you like them, you need to do abnormal psychology. Wednesday, we're going to very briefly cover chapter 15 and any questions you might bring about your application assignment 3, which is basically making 3 fake book profiles of people with psychological disorders. Okay, so with that said, we're going to start with anxiety disorders. And basically, the name says it all. The main symptom is excessive and unrealistic anxiety or fearfulness. So whenever we're talking about psychological disorders, we have to understand, remember we defined on Wednesday, it has to have an element of dysfunction, and some anxiety is normal. If you're a little anxious right now because you got finals coming up, into the semester, you're dealing with your job or whatever, and you have that feeling in your stomach sometimes, that's normal, right? It's problematic if it lasts for a long time. It doesn't have a realistic source of that free-floating anxiety. This is just, you can't identify what you're anxious about, right? Generalized anxiety disorder, sometimes it's abbreviated GAD, feelings of dread and impending doom, along with physical symptoms of stress, which, as you guys know, we've talked about before, can be quite a bit, which lasts 6 months or longer. So yeah, it's normal to be stressed occasionally, but if it goes on forever, or it just doesn't even have to be forever, just more than 6 months, yeah, that's not normal, and you should probably get help for it. And the good news is there's a lot of good ways to deal with anxiety, right? We'll talk a bit about those on Wednesday, right? So included in anxiety disorders are phobias. We've talked briefly about phobias in, I think, chapter 5, learning. And we talked about how classical conditioning can be used to help people get over them, as actually even operant conditioning in different ways, right? Okay, so irrational persistent fear of something. Social phobias, we talked about these. Social anxiety disorder. This is just you're afraid of interacting with others or being in social situations that might lead people to think poorly of you. A specific phobia is just fear of a specific something. So let's look at some examples there. Claustrophobia. Fear of being in a small enclosed space, okay, irrational fear. This is quite common. I used to say jokingly I had claustrophobia because I was afraid to go into porta potties. And then one time I was in Mexico City, they have this really great interactive museum. And I didn't have any better idea than to go in this dark maze where you had to crawl through things that mushed you and like through little tiny tubes, and people were behind me. I literally almost had a panic attack there. And then I realized that I actually do have some genuine claustrophobia, but hey, it's really easy for me to avoid crawling in little tiny holes with people around me, right? So not a problem. Acrophobia, fear of heights. Anybody have fear of heights? Yeah, it's quite normal. It happens a lot. Now, it is normal to be worried if you're up in a really scary high place and you're afraid. That's not really a disorder. That's normal, right? It's disordered if you have an irrational fear of heights, like you have vertigo and you feel like you're going to throw yourself off. If you don't want to, my youngest son has real fear of heights, and when he was, as soon as he could talk, he'd tell his brother, Ian, don't get so close to that ledge, even if it was a perfectly safe ledge. Okay, so it's a thing. You can, however, get over it to a certain extent. Agoraphobia, literally fear of the marketplace, which is agora, fear of being in a place or situation where you can't escape, okay? Fear of being in the open. You have to have anxiety in 2 of 5 situations. And people who have agoraphobia are frequently afraid to leave their house. They are housebound. Okay? They have such anxiety when they go out. They can have panic attacks. I think that's actually the next one here. A panic disorder. Panic attacks occur frequently enough to cause the person difficulty in adjusting to daily life, okay? Panic attack is just intense panic. Sometimes people think they're having a heart attack. They think they're dying. If you watch The Sopranos, Tony Soprano has panic attacks, right? It's pretty realistic there. Panic disorder with agoraphobia is when you've had a couple panic attacks and it's such an unpleasant experience, and it can be, you know, public and everything, people are afraid to leave their house because they're afraid they're going to have panic attacks, right? Agoraphobia, Lauren Hillenbrand, who wrote Unbroken, which is a great book about Louis Zamperini and World War II, and also Secretariat. Also, these were made movies too, I believe, at least Secretariat was. I don't know about Unbroken. She has agoraphobia. She's housebound, at least she was when she wrote these books. So yeah, it's very debilitating. Here's your textbook's little table of common anxiety disorders and their symptoms. So you can refer to that if you need to when you're taking your exam or to study, right? It's just out of curiosity. These things are always interesting, right? Closely related to anxiety, sometimes also grouped with personality disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder. So if you watch As Good as It Gets, I think I mentioned that with Jack Nicholson, his character has a OCD, washes his hands many, many times, turtles all the way down about a girl with OCD. Recurring thoughts or obsessions that create anxiety, and the way they get control of that anxiety and relieve that anxiety is performing the compulsion. So the obsession and then the compulsion is what they do to try to control that anxiety, which might be washing your hands, right? Might be checking 5 times to make sure you turn the oven off. Might be having everything in your house set up just so, right? Obsession, the thoughts, compulsion, the behavior. And you know, again, if it's interfering with your ability to function, it's a disorder. When we see people loosely use the term OCD, I get OCD about that, or he does, or she does. You know, this is, again, trying to control your environment. A little bit of it's not going to hurt if it's interfering with your ability to function. If you're buying 50 bars of soap a day because you're so OCD about washing your hands and germs. A lot of people with OCD are obsessed with germs, right? Then we have a problem, right? Acute stress disorder. Okay, this is acute means it's short term. Okay, it doesn't last very long, resulting from exposure to a major stressor. So we know what the cause is, right? It has a known cause: anxiety, dissociation, nightmares. You can't sleep, you can't concentrate. Lasting as long as 1 month following the event. Okay, this again, I want to say it's normal because it's not, it's bad. But on the other hand, it goes away. It is not generalized anxiety disorder or anything like that. I just want you guys to notice that problems in concentration, stress causes us to have problems in concentration, right? Any stress, and when you have like bad anxiety, it's worse, okay? I'm sure you've all been in that situation where you're trying to learn something, or maybe work, or maybe for school, and we're just like looking at the same thing, trying it over and over again, and we are so unfocused because of stress that we can't learn. So this is a real problem, okay? A real problem if you can't concentrate, you cannot learn. If you're a student, you cannot perform your job well. If you are working, right? Can't focus on your family properly. Altogether, not a good thing. And then, of course, we have PTSD. So this is long-term stress disorder, okay? Post-traumatic stress disorder lasts more than a month. That differentiates it from acute. It might not develop for a long time after the event, okay? So maybe you have PTSD from war, you come home, you go back to your family, or you get married, you have kids, you go to work, everything's great, and then you get retired and you have all this time on your hands, and maybe you develop PTSD. Okay, maybe you manage to, and we'll talk about kind of the way we explain things, right? Maybe you repress those memories, or you just get to work, you work like crazy, you forget something bad that's happened, but then it happens. So, right, it can occur years after the event. Women are more susceptible, but certainly plenty of men have had PTSD. Causes. Okay, so these are going to make, sense. We've already seen the way different theorists explain things. Psychoanalysts, repressed urges and desires, that creates anxiety, which results in abnormal behavior. Hence the lying on the sofa and trying to talk and get bring out of from that, out to the top of the iceberg so you can see it, all those issues you have. The idea, once you get them out and be open and you deal with them, you will no longer exhibit these anxiety-related behaviors. Behaviorists, of course, they think that it's learned through positive and negative reinforcement. Cognitive psychologists, again, excess anxiety comes from illogical, irrational thought processes, right? If you are, it's normal to be anxious, but if it goes on for a long time, if it doesn't have a discernible cause, if it's causing you to not be able to function, then it is illogical, irrational. You're letting it get hold of you too much, right? Or it is. Some of the mechanisms that cognitive psychologists talk about is magnification. The tendency to interpret situations as more dangerous, as worse than they actually are, okay? Who's done this sometime? Yeah, we all sometimes interpret something as worse than it is, all right? That's human. When it's dysfunctional, when it's causing you to have behaviors that are dysfunctional, it's problematic. All or nothing thinking. That's when you think that it's got to be perfect or it's a failure, okay? And it can apply much more broadly. If you think everything has to be like this way, or it can't be at all, or I'm going to pack up my toys and go home, that kind of thing, right. Again, dysfunctional. It causes anxiety because, of course, if you're holding yourself to that kind of standard, you're going to be failing a lot, right? Overgeneralization. This is when you interpret a single negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat and failure. So, for example, say I came into class and I gave a lecture early in the semester or early in my teaching career and it was a flop. And I decided, okay, because of that, I'm a failure as a teacher. I can't do it. I may as well just go get a job as a computer programmer, something like that. That would be overgeneralization, right? Now, realistically, everybody who tries to teach people, who gets up in lectures, we got flops. Some of my lectures are worse than others. Sometimes I'm not there in the morning. I don't have energy. Sometimes the class doesn't respond, right? But if we think that that's a sign of a total failure, that's overgeneralization. Conversely, we can at the same time minimize our successes. Okay, so people who have anxiety tend to minimize the good things and overgeneralize the bad things, which just leads to greater anxiety, right? You guys are seeing Winnie the Pooh when you're little? That was one little anxious, the little donkey, what's his name, Eeyore? Depressed, anxious individual, right? If you have a tail that falls off, problematic, right? Biological explanations of anxiety. Here, again, you'll be unsurprised to hear there's genetic components, chemical imbalances, so neurotransmitters, so serotonin and GABA. There's evidence of increased activity in the amygdala and limbic system. So remember, that's where we process emotions, fear. The amygdala is very active in fear situations. So anxiety is very related to fear. Okay, whether this is a cause or just a correlation, well, we don't know, but there is definitely something going on there. Okay, some interesting cultural variations. So ataque de nervios, that's when you have get very anxious, etc. And then we have very typical in Hispanic cultures. I wonder if I can see this here. Probably not, because as I recall, this isn't even the more interesting one. So let's see. Okay, I'm gonna just go out and we'll look at them. If I can spell properly. Okay. Here we go, it's a lot of them. Illness category frequently used by Hispanic individuals to describe one or more particular symptoms. Some overlap with panic disorder, okay? And then we also have some other interesting ones. We have CORO, which is really fascinating, fear of genital loss. So let's, CORO, this one is just fascinating to me. And you have these links, remember, if you download the PDF from my PowerPoint, you can go straight here. So, oops, it didn't happen, did it? No, all right. Still didn't happen? Okay, all right, let's do it this way. Open hyperlink. Okay. Or the fear of genital retraction, right? Fear of the genitals shrinking and retracting into the body, sometimes referred to as genital retraction syndrome. So cases have been found in worldwide, right? But first identified in ancient China, okay, follows an identical pattern, suffer tingling sensation, rapid onset panic attack. So there's that associated, clearly this is associated with anxiety, right? Would be tragic for a lot of people. Genital loss would be pretty bad, right? Fear almost always associated with accompanied by an imminent fear of death, sometimes missing in other parts. So a panic disorder, right? During the burning times of medieval Europe, witches were held responsible for genital retractions in the local population. The symptoms subsided when the witches were appeased. That brings up all sorts of interesting questions. So how did they measure the genital retraction and shrinkage in the local population? Okay, I don't mean to make light of it. I'm sure it is a terrible thing to have. And then we have TKS, which is a form of intense anxiety disorder. The point is it's culture-bound syndrome. So things that are labeled and talked about specifically within a specific cultural context that we don't speak about in the same way in other places, might not even exist. Okay, there's another one which I don't have on this slide where I can't remember what it's called, but I think it's like in like Indochina or somewhere around there where young men suddenly go crazy and like run around being violent. There's a word for that too. Again, it's a cultural thing. Okay, moving on. Any questions about anxiety disorders? Okay, clearly there's more phobias. There's a lot more detail you can go into, but we do need to cover a lot of material here. So we're going to move on to dissociative disorders. So if anybody did their major myths in psychology on the schizophrenia, and they probably would have pointed out that, the myth that schizophrenia has multiple personalities, that's really, the multiple personality is really this dissociative identity disorder, or DID. That's when you seem to have two or more distinct personalities. You can also have dissociative amnesia. That's when you forget part of your episodic memory goes haywire. You forget part of your personal life history. Sometimes you completely forget who you are, everything, right? Dissociative fugue. That's when people, if they're lucky, they'll suddenly get somewhere, they wake up somewhere, they come to conscious somewhere, and they don't know how they got there, okay? But they still know who they are. Sometimes that's just amnesia for the trip. Sometimes it's complete. They'll suddenly find themselves somewhere and they don't remember part of, maybe not their name even, right? Dissociative fugue. So why do these things happen? Psychodynamic, of course, about repression of memories, okay? Seeing dissociation as a defense mechanism against anxiety. I'll talk a little bit more, but look at the cognitive and behavioral. Dissociative is a disorder, is a kind of avoidance learning. Maybe it's shading little by little, right? So here the idea is if something really traumatic happens to you and you just can't deal with the psychological consequences, the anxiety, the stress from that traumatic happening, rather than work through it, you just invent a completely new personality. That's another person who doesn't remember the other. So people with DID who have different personalities, they can invent an entire, maybe not consciously, a new person that doesn't have that trauma, right? So they don't remember. So if they're a different person, they don't remember the person who went under, the personality who had that horrible experience, right? So that's the idea, kind of a really elaborate defense mechanism or escape mechanism to avoid feeling the way you feel. You just create another personality. Okay. Biological explanations, lower than normal activity. So the people who have dissociative disorders have less activity in regions associated with body awareness. Okay. Again, correlation. Do we know that causes it? I don't know. Depersonalization, derealization disorder. Okay, this is when the person feels very detached from themselves. Okay, they just feel like this has nothing to do with me. They might still know who they are, but they feel very detached, that you know, alone and separate from everything that's happening around them and themselves, even their own bodies. Okay, any questions about dissociative disorders? Some interesting books and stories about people with dissociative disorders. You can Google them. You find some interesting videos out there too. So on to something more common. So anxiety disorders, quite common. Dissociative disorders, not so much. Mood disorders, quite common. Now with, you know, I think I mentioned this the other day, that normally, you know, I don't know what it is, like 9% of the population has a mood disorder, but actually they measured in depression in 2019, like 11%, and during the height of the epidemic, 41%. Okay, so depression, mood disorders include depression. So disorders in which the mood is severely disturbed. Remember we distinguished emotion from mood way back in chapter 9 or something. So emotion is the emotional reaction to a concrete stimuli. So that happens right there, whereas a mood is more long-term affect. So either positive or negative affect, so you feel good or feel bad. A mood lasts a long, there it says affect is in psychological terms just refers to emotion or mood, and we usually talk about just positive and negative affect, whereas we have a lot of specific emotions, right? Mood lasts a long time, emotions are a short-term reaction, right? So mood disorders, major depressive disorder, severely depressed mood that comes on suddenly and has no external cause. This does not mean it doesn't have a trigger. So people with major depressive disorder, their depression, and that's not even necessarily the right way to think about it. A better way to think about it might be just inability to think logically. So disrupted thought patterns, and we'll talk about that in terms of cognitive psychology in a minute, but I mean, I have acquaintances who've explained to me that it's not so much that you're depressed or sad necessarily, it's just you cannot make choices properly. Sometimes you can't make choices at all. Okay, you don't know how to, you lose your sense of prioritization, so you can't prioritize properly. You make bad choices or no choices, right? Some illogical thought patterns. So there might be triggers, but there's no like evident external cause or rationale, logical rationale for that state of that thought pattern of that depression, right? Seasonal affective disorder, this is just a mood disorder, so it can be depression, it can be just falling asleep all the time, caused by lack of sunlight, not enough sunlight. I was actually diagnosed with this as a child, as a teenager, I think. I was falling asleep in mass, which my mother strongly disapproved of. And so she took me to the doctor and he told me, well, this is, and I was falling asleep in class and everything too, but my mother didn't worry about that so much as the embarrassment of standing right in front of the priest and me zonking out. And so I was just told to make sure I was out in the sunlight as much as I could be during the winter, and I sat under lights, you know, ultra red lights, totally fixed it. So for my entire life, if I start falling asleep and feeling like lethargic during the winter, I just have to go out and get sunlight or lights. So yeah, this is quite common as well. I never felt sad, I just fell asleep, but some people do feel like generalized, you know, depressed mood, right? Okay, so now the biggie that we see a lot in fiction, bipolar disorder, okay? Mood that ranges from normal to manic with or without episodes of depression, okay? So manic episode, excessive excitement, energy, elation, or irritability, okay? People who are manic, I mean, you have the whole movie thing when they're like run off, like that Drew Barrymore one that's really cute. She goes off to Mexico, or you know, they spend a lot of money or think they can fly, all this stuff that sometimes got people hospitalized. But manic episodes can be much more subtle. It could just be a lot of energy, productive energy sometimes. So some artists don't want to medicate because it's very productive. Maybe they're just excessively happy. Excess sexual interest also can be involved with this. And the manic episode is frequently followed. So we have bipolar 1 with no episodes of depression. It's just normal or manic. Bipolar 2 interspersed with episodes of depression and hypomania, which is lower mood, right? Low. For people who have bipolar 2, a manic episode when they feel really great and the whole world is, you know, their oyster and they're wonderful, that can be followed, boom, crash by a huge crash that shows that sends them spiraling into severe depression. Okay, so some people with bipolar 2, they will avoid, they know their triggers for manic episodes. They will avoid them, try to avoid them as much as possible because they know that the crash is horrible. Others enjoy the manic or, because of the productivity. There's speculation that Isaac Newton had bipolar 2 because he was either severely depressed or he had episodes of extreme energy, which led to a lot of his discoveries, right? He was also like head of the mint or whatever in the UK, Britain then. So range of emotions, here's a little chart. I feel like we've seen this one before, but of course I've taught this off and I forget. Everywhere from extreme sadness to extreme elations. So we all have a fluctuation of emotions over the course of time, day or several days or whatever. A person with a mood disorder has extreme and therefore abnormal. Now, extreme sadness, if someone just died, that is normal, okay? But someone with a mood disorder can get very sad, can be extremely elated, which would be the manic episode. And sometimes they might not even know they're sad. They might just not be able to function in a way that's productive in their lives, right? So why do people have mood disorders? Yep, you won't be surprised that behavioral theories link it to learned helplessness. Do you remember Martin Seligman and the dogs, learned helplessness, how the dogs, if they were forced to be shocked, then after they opened an escape, they still didn't escape? Well, there is evidence people with depression have learned that they cannot fix things for themselves. Maybe a specific, acute episode of something taught them that they couldn't make themselves feel better. Not only like as far as thinking properly and logically, but even doing the minimal kind of tasks of daily life, that kind of dysfunction. Cognitive theorists hold that depression is a part of distorted illogical thinking. And certainly there's a lot of that. If you talk to people who have been diagnosed with depression, they'll tell you that it's really about, a broken record. One of my friends calls it a broken record in his mind. Okay, something triggers it. And he's like over and over thinking on stuff that's not, not conducive to his emotional well-being, right? The inability to make good choices, right? To prioritize. Biological explanations, this is the kind when we're thinking about Prozac and stuff. So they look at the chemical imbalances in your brain. There are some evidence of genetic origins as well. So this is true. We don't really understand how it works, but giving people Prozac, which is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which if you recall back to chapter 2, reuptake is when they take it back out of the synaptic clefts, the part between neurons, bring it back. So if there's less serotonin circulating, that's not good. Or anyway, putting more into circulation means that does alleviate depression for a while. But the latest research shows that long-term antidepressants don't work. So what they can do is bring people out of the depths of depression for long enough for them to see cognitive behavioral therapy therapists who can help them fix that distorted illogical thinking, right? Going back to the ancient Greeks and humors, melancholia. Hippocrates thought it was caused by an excess of black bile. Remember, he talked about the 4 humors being out of balance. That causes according to the Greeks, that causes mental illness, right? Melancholia, a mental condition, especially a manic depressive condition characterized by extreme depression, bodily complaints, and often hallucinations and delusions. Another thing, people with depression, major depression, bipolar, tend to have a lot of comorbidity. We talked about that on Wednesday, with that's 2 or more psychological disorders occurring at the same time. How do you tease them apart? Well, that's tough. People with depression are more likely to have alcohol abuse and other drug abuse problems. So they can have delusions, hallucinations. Modern usage of melancholy in psychology, melancholy is just non-specific depression. Okay, that's not necessarily major, not bipolar, the mental symptoms only. There's a great film called Melancholia, which is actually an apocalyptic one, but it also deals with depression. It's worth seeing. Okay, We're gonna now talk, you guys are gonna talk, we're gonna have one online room, or maybe how many people are there? There's two, I might do two online, and then one here. I want you guys to talk about labeling. So I think I mentioned it last Wednesday. To label something is to assign a name or label or a category. Labeling is the process of attaching a descriptive word or phrase to someone. So for example, this could be diagnosing, so labeling someone as having, major depression, right? Or anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder. So what are some of the pros and cons? What are the benefits and what are the problems of labeling people, specifically in the context of psychological disorders? Okay, so you three here, you can stand up and talk, and I'll put you guys online in some breakout rooms here. Let me pause the recording. Oops. Recording. Close this. And let's keep going. Okay. So moving on, any questions then about mood disorders? Any other thing we've talked about? Okay, let's go on to eating disorders. So eating disorders are just conditions when people are so preoccupied with eating and their weight and body shape and everything that they can't focus on anything else. And they also engage in bad behaviors that are not healthy, unhealthy behaviors. So more women than men have EDs. And curiously enough, in my personal life, I've known a lot more men with eating disorders, specifically anorexia and bulimia. And we'll see those in a sec, because I rode racehorses at a racetrack for many years. And jockeys feel extreme pressure to keep a low body weight. And especially for men, that's difficult. So a lot of eating disorders happen there. Another place where people who are models, also extreme pressure to remain thin, also problematic. It's about a lot more than food, and we're going to talk about that in a sec. So that book I put up there, Gaining, is by an author acquaintance of mine. She suffered anorexia. She's anorexic. She got over it. She wrote her first book called Solitaire about her journey overcoming anorexia. But later, when she was in her 40s, I believe, or maybe a little older, in her midlife, in the middle of her life, she had kind of a regression. She had trouble fighting it again. And hers, what happens after? Gaining, the truth about life after eating disorders. Do you really ever get over it? It turns out most people don't. Okay, well, not most, but a huge percentage. We'll see that in a minute. First, let's define them. Oops, I have a chat here. Okay. So anorexia is just when eating is reduced. So people eat so little that their body weight is significantly low, or lower than is considered healthy. So usually it's associated with a BMI, body mass index, of less than 18.5. I'm going to sneeze. Wait. Now, if you're really thin and extremely fit, like if you're riding racehorses or if you're a long distance runner, you can be pretty borderline 18.5 and still healthy, but generally that's low. And it's not good for our bones if we're too low, lightweight, because they don't get enough impact that makes them strengthen, right? Bulimia is when the cycle of binging or overeating, and then either purging or other methods to avoid weight gain. So purging is just forcing yourself to puke. Also, for example, running. So some people with bulimia, maybe they don't necessarily vomit, but if they eat such amount of calories, they then get on a treadmill and run until they burn all those calories. Okay, if that's interfering with their normal life, then it is obviously very problematic. Binge eating is uncontrolled binge eating. This is they didn't actually call this a disorder before. The only difference with bulimia is there's no purging or exercising or whatever to counteract. You just eat too much occasionally, sometimes often, right? Very unhealthy, all of them. Both bulimia and anorexia tend to mean you're not getting the appropriate nutrients. So your bones are going to be affected. Your health is going to be affected. Your heart can be. If you are vomiting, that means acid that should be staying in your stomach is going up and getting around your teeth on a regular basis. What does this mean for your teeth? They rot, okay, and your gums. Very, very bad stuff. Obviously, being low weight leads to more osteoporosis later on. So causes of eating disorder. Risk factors, adolescent or young adult female, that's when it starts. But like you look down at treatment, you go only 40 to 60% of those with anorexia make a recovery. Okay, and it's a lifelong battle for people with anorexia. Sometimes people can have both anorexia and bulimia. It can start as bulimia and evolve towards anorexia. Genetic components, yeah, it's about a lot more than just, you know, your image or your body weight. Ultimately, it's about control. Okay, so just as we talked about people who feel like their life's spinning out of control might become maybe a little bit OCD, right? The one thing in life you have absolute control over is what goes into your mouth. Now, that doesn't mean you can choose to put anything in it, but you can always say no until you're in the hospital with a tube down your throat because being force-fed because you are so low body weight, you can control what goes in your mouth. So for some people, that's the ultimate thing. When everything else is going crazy, they cannot eat, right? Eating disorders are associated with perfectionism, okay? There are also, you know, there's all sorts of different things like this, you could read more about it. This, you know, this is just a basic course, but parents who are putting a lot of pressure or aren't enough involved. So there's all sorts of different environmental things, but just remember, it's not just about being thin or something, it's ultimately about control. And that's one thing you can control when nothing else can be controlled. So moving on, any questions about eating disorders? Sexual dysfunctions and problems. Sexual dysfunction is what it sounds like. Physical workings of sex acts, sex interest, arousal, and response. So first to clarify, now we, you know, asexual, we talked about the list a little bit in our gender and sexuality chapter. If someone is asexual and not interested in sex and they're happy that way, it is not a dysfunction. It's not a disorder. When does sexual dysfunction with sexual interest become a problem? Well, if you're in a relationship, okay? If you're in a relationship, sex is an important component of it. And especially if the problem is when the levels of sexual interest are a mismatch between the two partners, right? Then lack of sexual interest can be an issue, okay? It can be an issue just because your image of yourself is that you have sexual desire, and if you suddenly don't, then that's a problem with sexual interest. Arousal and response, both we talked about those in the chapter, the corresponding, or any defect, any like dysfunction in there it can be a problem, right? About 40 to 45% of women, 20 to 30% of men. Okay, we talked about the Kinsey studies and everything before. That's when we first started to study it. Rate increases as we age. Why is that? So for women, menopause can affect things. For men, as older you get, the more erectile dysfunction is a possible, and probably for most men, a guaranteed situation at some point, because ability to maintain an erection and so forth goes down and down. Prostate, issues with the prostate removal. In, you know, marriages which are supposedly not threatened before prostate removal, 50% of them fail in the year after prostate removal. This is because sex is pretty important, okay? It's pretty important to men, their whole image of themselves. To women, probably in different ways, right? So really problematic. The DSM-5, sexual desire, arousal disorders, physical active intercourse, timing or ability to reach orgasm, right? Organic factors. Organic would be, for example, if you have your prostate removed and the nerves are cut, you cannot have an erection. Okay, full stop, that's it. For women after menopause, natural lubrication of the vagina, etc., is down because of hormones. Okay, you can't really do much about that, right? It's natural, normal. Sociocultural, psychological. A lot of sexual dysfunctions are psychological. Okay, think of people who've been raped. Okay, people who've learned to associate sex with something traumatic. Okay, remember learning really contributes here. Okay, treatment, medication, Viagra, huge industry. There's one thing you can sell people is ways to make sex better. right? Psychotherapy that can help, especially with some the psychological issues. Hormone therapy, like I said, low levels of testosterone, et cetera, progesterone, all that affects your sexual function. Stress reduction. Stress is a sex killer too. So a lot of the counseling will start with get rid of your sex and the pressure. Pressure doesn't work either. Nothing worse than feel pressure to actually have sexual desire. That's not going to work, right? Stress causes, really contributes to sexual dysfunction. So if you get rid of that stress, it helps. Sex therapy, behavioral training. So yeah, important for relationships, and relationships really is what make the world goes round. Very important. So it's part of it. Okay, we've got plenty of time. So moving on, any questions about so far sexual disorders? A lot of information. One time I actually roomed, I was at a conference in Boston. I roomed with someone whose area of expertise were sexual disorders. Really interesting. Something she was clinical, so completely different, but really interesting. So schizophrenia. Severe disorder in which the person suffers from disordered thinking, bizarre behavior, hallucinations sometimes. Key thing, cannot distinguish between fantasy and reality. Okay, doesn't know what really is happening. A Beautiful Mind is a book, and then a movie they made on it about Nash. Really, really interesting. Fun to watch, a pretty accurate portrayal. Psychotic episode, a break away from the ability to perceive what is real and what is fantasy, okay? This, as you can imagine, is severely dysfunctional. And we're gonna go into some more detail here. So schizophrenia can be characterized by positive or negative symptoms. So just like when we talked about reinforcement and punishment, positive means you add something. Positive symptoms are just excesses of behavior or something that occurs in addition to normality, right? So hallucinations, false sensory perceptions, like hearing voices, okay, seeing things, right? Delusions, those are false beliefs, and held by someone who refuses to accept evidence of their falseness. Now, we could talk about huge chunks of the population too that has false beliefs, but this is a little bit more than things like, false election results and all that stuff, which is also a delusion, but not the same kind of thing. Distorted thinking. Negative symptoms, remember positive, you add something negative, you take it away, less than normal behavior or absence of normal behavior. Poor attention, flat affect, which means no emotional responsiveness. So somebody with flat affect will neither get upset or happy. It doesn't have either the positive or negative reactions. I don't like to use positive or negative because we're talking about positive and negative symptoms, but right, they neither respond with sufficient happiness in response to something good or sadness or upset in response to something bad. Poor speech production. So schizophrenia can go undiagnosed if most of the symptoms are negative, because it can be someone who simply, at times, it's not 24/7, but at times seems incapable of normal human interaction, can't focus on conversations or on their job. When they're in a social situation, they just kind of sit there and don't react properly. They have trouble. Even when it looks like they are trying to say something, they have trouble organizing their speech properly in order to communicate. I remember a couple years ago, I had a student who volunteered the information that his grandfather had just been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And an older person, lived his entire life, had grandchildren before he was diagnosed. And that my student was like, it was such a relief to understand that my grandfather, when he had these episodes where nobody could deal with him, it wasn't that he didn't love anyone, he just had schizophrenia. So he demonstrated this total subtle withdrawal from the people he loved, flat affect, inability to really communicate, very typical of schizophrenia. Of course, the famous ones that you hear about are hallucinations and hearing voices, which is also a thing, but that tends to not escape notice, and you get diagnosed as soon as it starts happening, right? So delusions, like I said, they're false beliefs. held by people who refuse to accept evidence of their falseness. So delusions of persecution is just what it sounds like. They believe someone's out to get them, right? Often accompanied with voices, you know. Delusions of reference, that's just the belief that everything is about them, okay? They hear something on the radio about, and it's about them, even though it can't possibly be about them, right? Delusions of influence, that's kind of believing that you have more influence than you do, or that people who are influential are talking, you know, related to you, talking to you. Delusions of grandeur, this is something we hear about in popular press. This is like genuinely believing that you're, you know, a prince or something, or that you have a lot more power or wealth than you actually do. And remember, these people actually believe it. Okay, you cannot show them that this is not the case. They're not going to believe evidence to the contrary, right? Speech and thought disturbances, catatonia. Catatonia, when I think of it, I mean, it's, and I don't know if it's true that it's just mainly this way. When we talk about people being catatonic, it means they're completely unresponsive. And my image is like a board all stiff. I don't know why I have that image. But total lack of movement is when you don't, you know, stiff, like a board one way or the other, or excessive wild movement, like really crazy motions all the time. That's, both of those are being catatonic. Typical schizophrenia in the worst episodes of it. Causes, okay, biological as usual, focusing on the brain, either neurotransmitters, so dopamine, certainly with catatonia, you know, it probably have something to do with it. There are structural differences in the brain if they do brain scans of people with schizophrenia. There's a really strong genetic influence, up to 50% if you have a full, I say full sibling as if it was a horse, but you know, monozygotic twins, an identical twin, or both parents have had schizophrenia, you have nearly a 50% chance of also developing schizophrenia. To the extent that I've known people who have decided not to have children because they have siblings with schizophrenia, right? Big genetic component. Now, behaviorists, you will be unsurprised to learn, believe it's all about reinforcement, observational learning, shaping, right? This can affect the symptoms, the behavioral symptoms, right? Cognitive theorists, of course, talk about the severely irrational thinking, and certainly it's extremely irrational to believe, you know, to hear voices. Okay, that's a delusion. To believe that the president of the United States has called you up, okay? Things like that. To believe that when you're listening to the radio, the news, and it's all about something happening to you. Severely irrational thinking. Okay, so the stress vulnerability model kind of combines the things that, as usual, kind of the gene environment interaction, biological sensitivity or genetic, you know, vulnerability to certain disorder that will develop under the right conditions. Okay, so you have to have the genetic predisposition, because a huge component of schizophrenia is genetic, but not everybody, you know, not every full twin, you know, identical twin of a schizophrenic person is going to develop schizophrenia. So clearly there are environmental factors here. So here we have oh yeah, you can see it up there. I can't see it well on my screen. So you can see that in the general population, there's 1%. 1% of people will develop schizophrenia. If you have a spouse, you're more likely to develop it, but that's kind of like on the environment side, okay, because they're not related. But you go all the way up. So siblings with a schizophrenic parent, 17%. Dizygotic, so fraternal twins, 17%. But like I said before, nearly 50% of monozygotic twins, right? So yes, obviously there's an environmental component, but it's also very genetic. Okay, any questions about schizophrenia? That and dissociative identity disorder are the two like real fiction getters that we see a lot of stories about, but also personality disorders. So personality disorders are really tricky. They're considered to not really have any good cure, although cognitive behavioral therapy can help. We'll talk about that Wednesday, actually. So hence personality, because personality is enduring, right? So forth. Disorder in which a person adopts a persistent, rigid, and maladaptive pattern of behavior that interferes with normal social interactions. We have 3 clusters here. A, eccentric or odd, paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal. Okay, so these are like, and the cluster A is kind of similar to what you see in schizophrenia, but not as severe. You can have, you know, schizoid, they both mainly like very eccentric behaviors, like people who, again, very similar to schizophrenia, but like you can have people who are very suspicious of people who have, what do you call it? Preppers or something. Prepping behavior, when it's to the extreme, is definitely a sign. I can't remember if it's schizoid or schizotypal, when you don't want strangers on your place. Okay, people who are very suspicious of strangers, don't allow them on their place. They have, you know, food enough to last them. And then I'm a bit of a prepper, but this is like exaggerated, right? Conspiracy theories. So people who believe conspiracy, there is a slight correlation between schizotypal personality disorder, I believe, and probably all the cluster A's and belief in conspiracy theories, right? Cluster B, behavior is dramatic, emotional, or erratic, antisocial, borderline, histrionic, narcissistic. We talked a little bit about narcissistic personality disorder, I believe, before. Antisocial, there's all really borderline personality disorder is a great. Girl Interrupted is a good book. I think they made it into a movie. People with borderline personality disorder have a lot of trouble with personal relationships because either, I think, well, actually I had that should be on the next slide. We'll keep going. Cluster C, anxiety or fearfulness. So like avoidant dependent personality disorder. We talk about codependent relationships when 2 people have an unhealthy dependency, right? And obsessive compulsive. So yeah, here's my slide with a little more detail. Antisocial, no morals or conscience, and behaves impulsively with disregard for consequences. Okay. Borderline personality, maladaptive personality pattern in which the person is moody or unstable, lacks a clear sense of identity, clings to others. Interesting thing is that somebody with borderline personality disorder might one day be super clingy. Maybe they're your best friend, maybe it's a friendship, maybe it's a significant other, and they, you know, they can't get enough of them. They're very clingy, they're anxious, they're worried. The next day they will feel disgust for the partner or the person. It's really hard to have a relationship with people like that because one day they're all over you, the next day they genuinely feel that you're disgusting, right? They have this disgust reaction. Complicated situation makes it very hard for them to have a fulfilling relationships in their lives. What are the other ones I mentioned here? We could go forever on these, but you could just take another class. So they're really interesting, especially if you don't have to deal with them. If you actually have to deal with them yourself or people who you love, it can be quite complicated. So why? What happens? So cognitive learning. Here is personality disorders, learned behavior that has become maladaptive. So basically bad habits. So a habit is just you repeat it so much, it's automated. You don't have a lot of control anymore. Belief systems are illogical, right? Biological looks at the genetic factors. And then we have, you know, possible causes, family relationships. So childhood abuse, neglect, parenting. I don't know that there's a lot of proof of this, but these are certainly good. Looks like there's some association, especially with borderline personality disorder and parenting. There appears to be some association as well as with sexual abuse as well. Right. Oh, and this is kind of a fun thing. Well, let's see if we have time for this. We'll come back to it. This is Temple Grandin. He's really fun. I think we have time, but let's make sure that I don't have something else. Okay, so somatoform disorders. Okay, these are physical complaints that don't have a medical cause, and so they're assumed to be related, caused by mental activity, right? Psychological factors. And so some have been proven. So one example, somatoform. So one time, like fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome, were considered that, but now we know there's actually physical things going on, but it's complicated, right? Hypochondriasis, a person who's a hypochondriac believes she has a serious disease, he or she, despite repeated medical findings. So when it's really dysfunctional, right? Some people have a little bit of hypochondriac in them. My youngest son, he's always going to the doctor. He's like 20 and he's been to the doctor more than I have in the past couple of years. And so some people just see a lot more problems, but some people really think, usually when we're talking about this, this is when you believe you have something like cancer. And you just go to the doctor with every little sign, sure that you're imminent death, right? Somatization, multiple physical complaints that do not have a medical explanation, or nor do they suggest a specific known disease. Again, that psychological effect there. And for certain, what's going on in our head affects what's going on with us physically, right? Our head, after all, it's physical, right? Our brain is physical. Conversion disorder, sensory or motor symptoms without medical explanation. So unexplained paralysis, blindness, seizures. People do occasionally go blind or deaf, or they can't move, and there's no medical explanation that they can find, right? Oh, we got to watch this. And then there's Capgras syndrome. And we're going to watch this because this guy is great. Of course, now I'm going to have to probably I don't know why it doesn't work on this computer. Come on. I wonder if I can trim, start. It's not working. All right, I'll just Google it. Here it is. Uh-oh.
Neurologist about her. This refers to patients
Hang on.
who are otherwise normal. There's one extraordinary syndrome called Capgras syndrome, which is so rare that even most neurologists have not heard of it. This refers to patients who are otherwise normal. Sometimes they're a psychiatric syndrome, but sometimes it's like a head injury. The guy's been in a car accident and maybe been in a coma for a couple of weeks.
How come this looks like that? You guys see in blue too, right?
And then comes out of the coma, seems quite normal. Through
There we go.
one extraordinary syndrome called Capgras syndrome, which is so rare that even most neurologists have not heard of it. This refers to patients who are otherwise normal. Sometimes they're a psychiatric syndrome, but sometimes it's like a head injury. The guy's been in a car accident and maybe been in a coma for a couple of weeks, and then comes out of the coma, seems quite normal, fluent in conversation, not emotionally disturbed, not hysterical in any obvious way, seems quite normal, except that he has one profound delusion. He looks at his mother and he says, "Doctor, this woman looks exactly like my mother." You know? He looks exactly, but she's not my mother, she's an imposter. She's pretending to be my mother. Okay? It's a replica. And he says this with a perfectly straight face. There's nothing else wrong with this guy. Okay, you can read a newspaper, he can talk to you about politics, he can talk to you about the Monica Lewinsky case, he can talk about anything you want. Okay, but when he looks at his mother, he says, "This is an imposter, some other woman pretending to be my mother." How do you explain the extraordinary syndrome? The standard explanation is Freudian, and you find it in most psychiatry textbooks. And that is, this young man, when he was a baby, when he was an infant, like most infants, like all of us here, and the same argument applies in reverse to women, but I'll just talk about men. When you're babies, you have a strong sexual attraction to your mother. This is called the so-called Oedipus complex of Freud. Okay? I'm not saying I believe this, but I'm saying it's the standard view, okay? Then you grow up, and then you repress these forbidden sexual urges. Thank God, otherwise all of us would be sexually aroused by your mother, okay? And then along comes a blow to the head, bang, and these repressed sexual urges come flaming to the surface. And then you say, my God, if this is my mother, why am I feeling sexually aroused when I see her? Okay, she must be some other strange woman, maybe it's pheromones, who knows what it is. This is the standard explanation. And it's a very ingenious explanation, as indeed most Freudian explanations are. Okay? But it doesn't work because I've seen patients with Capgras syndrome who have the same delusion, not about their mother, but about their pet poodle, about the dog. Now you think about it, how does the Freudian explanation work here? You can start talking about the inherent bestiality in all human beings or something like that, but it simply doesn't work. And then I thought maybe there's a simple explanation for the syndrome, namely, we know that in the temporal lobes is an area called infratemporal cortex, which is concerned with just processing faces, recognizing faces. When that's damaged, you get prosopagnosia, you can no longer recognize people's faces. But when you look at any object in the world, it's processed there, and then it gets sent to the amygdala and to the limbic system, to the emotional centers of the brain, so you're emotionally aroused by what you're looking at. If it's a slide projector, obviously you're not emotionally aroused. If it's a light there, you're not aroused. When you look at a mother, you say, wow, it's my mom. There's this warm glow or this terror, as the case may be. Okay? When you look at your mother, when you look at somebody else who you've never seen before, there's no emotional arousal. So what I said was, maybe what's wrong with this guy is, maybe the face area is normal. That's why you can still say, yeah, it looks like my mother. It looks like my mother. But the message doesn't get to the amygdala because this wire is cut because of the energy. So he looks at his mother and he says, if it's my mom, why am I feeling anything? There's something weird here. There's some other strange woman. That's the only explanation that makes sense to him, given this disconnection I'm talking about. Now, how do you test this? Well, you can test it very easily by using what we call a galvanic skin response. But any one of you, if I show you computerized images on the computer of different objects, a slide projector, the message gets passed to the visual centers in the temporal lobes, and you identify a slide projector, goes to the amygdala, which gauges the emotional significance of what you're looking at. My God, is this a predator? My God, is this a mate? Is this my mom? Or is it just a slide projector? I can ignore it. Okay. The amygdala does that and it cascades into the rest of the limbic system, into the hypothalamic nuclei, down the autonomic nervous system. Okay. Down the autonomic nervous system. And then what happens is your skin starts sweating, your heart starts pounding, you prepare the body for fighting, fleeing, feeding, or sexual behavior. Okay? Your body gets prepared for action. Your heart starts pounding, and your skin starts sweating because you want to dissipate heat, because you're going to be doing something, you're going to be doing something active. Okay? You can measure the change in skin resistance by putting two electrodes on the palm of the hand. And this measures the change in resistance. So when I put any one of you here in front of the screen and show you a slide projector, there's no change in resistance. But if I show you a stranger, there's no change in resistance. But if I show you your mom, you say, wow, mom, okay? Instantly, it cascades in and it makes you, believe it or not, every time you see a mom, you sweat. All of you here, okay? Whereas if I show you some stupid inanimate object like the slide projector or something like a shoe or something like that, nothing happens. Unless you have a shoe fetish, then you can, that's a different matter, okay? Now, what about our patient? So we had a patient who came into our office, and I hooked him up to the galvanic skin response. I showed him slide protectors, nothing. That's obvious. I showed him tables and chairs, nothing. I showed him people he's never seen, nothing. Then I showed him his mother, nothing. No galvanic skin response. But if any one of you here in the audience will see the mother get a huge big galvanic response, this supports our argument that there's been a disconnection. The reason I'm telling you about the syndrome is it's a striking example of cognitive neuroscience, the power of.
Okay, we're going to stop there. We're almost done with the class, but that's a Capgras syndrome, a really interesting disorder that probably is not in your book, but is still interesting. We're not going to do that. Any questions? If you want to see the typogram in video is also really good if you guys want to see it at some point, but if not, we'll see you Wednesday. Make sure you check out application assignment 3 if you're gonna have any questions, and we're gonna really quickly go through chapter 15 on Wednesday, and then that'll be it. All right, bye, everyone.